All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We're diving into the world of software design today, specifically something called the composite pattern. We've got some interesting materials on this. I'm excited to dig in.
Yeah, composite patterns, it's all about building these hierarchical structures. How do we put objects together to make something bigger, something more complex?
Okay, so I'm thinking files and folders on a computer, right?
Exactly. That's a great way to visualize it. Individual files are kind of like the basic building blocks, and then you've got folders that can hold both files and even other folders inside. It's that nesting that's key.
So are we just talking about organizing data then? Or is this something more fundamental about how we write the code?
Oh, it's definitely more than just how the data looks. This is about design, about how we structure our software from the ground up. I mean, it is true that it helps represent relationships, those kind of tree-like structures, but it's the blueprint for the code that's important here. Our source is very clear on this. Composite is a design pattern, not just any old data structure.
Right, so we're not just talking about any tree. We're talking about a very specific way of building that tree in code.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's try to ground this with a real-world example. The materials mention a travel agency that wants a menu system for their website, and they want it organized in this tree-like structure. So you'd have your main categories like destinations, then break that down further like Europe, Asia, and then finally get down to individual options like Paris City Tour.
Perfect example. And that's where the problem comes in. How do you actually code that in a way that's, well, manageable? That's where composite comes in.
Okay, so spell that out for me. What's the actual problem that composite is solving in this travel agency example?
Okay, so think about it. You've got single items, like that Paris City tour, and then you've got whole categories, like European tours. Now, without composite, you probably have to write different code to handle each of those.
Right, because they seem like different things. A single tour versus a whole list of tours.
Exactly. And your code would have to know, okay, is this a single item or a category? What actions are allowed? But with composite, the beauty is you can treat them the same way. Your code doesn't have to care if it's dealing with one thing or a whole bunch of things.
So that uniformity, that's what makes it easier to manage this kind of complex menu.
Exactly. It simplifies things massively. Imagine the alternative, having to write separate code for handling individual tours versus entire regions. It would quickly become this tangled mess.
And probably a nightmare to update or change anything.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so how does this actually work? I mean, how does the composite pattern actually achieve this uniform treatment?
Well, the source lays out a few key parts. First, you have what they call the abstract component.
And just to clarify, I see here it's also called componenta abstracta in the source and opci menu, which I guess means menu option, if I'm reading that right.
Yep, that's it. It's like the master plan for all our menu items, whether they're individual items or whole categories. It lays out the common ground, the things you can do with any menu item.
So it's like the bare minimum, the essentials.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the composite itself. This is the one that actually holds other stuff, the container, you could say. In our material, it's also referred to as category.
Okay, so this is the folder in our file system analogy. And the source mentions that it specifically holds a list of these abstract components, right?
Yep. That's important. It needs to keep track of what's inside, whether it's more folders or individual files, to stick with that analogy.
And then finally, we have the leaf node, the node frinza, also called item menu, which means menu item. These are like the individual files, right?
Yeah.
The things that don't contain anything else.
Yeah.
Like our Paris City tour.
Exactly. That's your endpoint. No more branching out from there.
Okay, so we have our pieces laid out. Now, how do they actually fit together? What does this source say about implementation, how it's all put into code?
Right. Well, for the composite classes, the folders, they have this list where they can add and remove stuff, right? Add new menu items, remove old ones, all that. But here's the interesting part. Even the leaf nodes, the individual items, they also have these methods for adding and removing things.
Wait, but how does that make sense? A single tour can't really contain other tours, right?
Exactly. And that's the point. Those methods don't actually do anything in the leaf nodes. It's more like they're there just to keep things consistent.
Oh, so it's about maintaining that same interface, those same methods across all the different types of menu items.
You got it. That way, the rest of the code doesn't have to constantly check, am I dealing with a single item or a category? It can just use those same methods regardless.
That's clever. So whether you're dealing with the whole category of vacation packages or a single weekend getaway within it, you're using the same basic operations. That's got to be super flexible for a programmer.
Oh, incredibly. And the utilizari, as our source puts it, go way beyond just software menus. Think about restaurant menus. Same idea, categories and individual dishes.
Right. Appetizers, main courses, desserts, it's all the same basic structure.
And even things like organizing students into groups and series. Our source even mentions Syria E 2024 as an example. Really, anywhere you have this tree-like structure with both individual elements and groups of those elements, the composite pattern can be useful.
Makes you realize how many things in the world are organized this way.
Right. It's a pretty fundamental pattern.
Now, the source also points out some interesting connections, correlai, with other design patterns. For example, it says that the composite nodes, the categories, can be thought of as leaf nodes with extra stuff added on, like decoration.
Yeah, it links that to the decorator pattern. So it's like you're taking a basic menu item and adding on extra features that make it a container without changing its fundamental nature.
So it's still a menu item, it just has this added ability to hold other things.
Exactly. And then there's the connection to the chain of responsibility pattern.
Remind me, what's that one about?
Well, it's all about how different objects can handle different kinds of requests. And it ties in here because think about how a click on a menu item might be handled. It might go through different objects depending on whether it's a single item or a category.
Oh, right. So like if it's a category, it might need to open up a submenu, but if it's a single item, it might take you directly to that tours page.
Exactly. So these patterns all kind of weave together to create these more complex and flexible systems.
So big picture then, what's the key takeaway about the composite pattern?
I think the biggest thing is this. It gives us a way to build these hierarchical structures, these trees, in a way that's super flexible. And the real power is that we can treat both individual pieces and whole groups of pieces in exactly the same way. Our code doesn't have to constantly differentiate between them.
Right, which makes everything easier to manage, to change, to adapt. So, circling back to our travel agency, with Composite, they can now handle their whole complex menu with all those categories and tours without breaking a sweat. They can add stuff, remove stuff, rearrange stuff, all using those same basic operations.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it.
It makes you wonder, what other everyday structures could we model using this approach? You know, this idea that a single item in a whole group can behave the same way. What kind of cool, flexible systems could we build with that?
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive today.
My pleasure.